Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. My name is Quayson, and I am Professor of English and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Stanford University. The Jamestown neighborhood in today's Accra is famous for being the original hub of the Ga Mashie polity from the mid-16th century onward. This episode will delve into some of that history, as well as the social impact of the European forts and castles that were built on Accra's coast, their political effects, and the changing spatial landscape that they have demarcated well into the 20th and 21st centuries. Oral tradition suggests that the Ga arrived in Accra at different stages from about the 13th century, with the most popular account asserting that they appeared like a mass of ants from the eastern horizon, likely from the western part of today's Nigeria. The ant image accounts for the Akan name Nkran, or ants, by which the city is referred to this day. By the middle of the 17th century, the Ga were already a well-organized group with a discernible socio-political structure and 6 settlement townships or rural manji along the coastline that included Ga Mashie, Osu, La, Teshi, Nungua, and Tema. In the 17th century, the capital of the Ga polity was situated at Ayawaso, some 11 miles inland from today's coastline. The Abonse market at Ayawaso was a major hub for the exchange of goods between the coastal peoples and those of the hinterland. European goods such as cloth, basins, knives, guns, and rum were exchanged for gold and slaves at the market. In addition to the imported commodities, produce such as salt, fish, and cattle were sold by the Ga in exchange for crops from the fertile inland regions. Abonse market was so well organized that it had its own trade minister who regulated prices and levied taxes on commercial transactions. It was extremely powerful. While there had always been some level of traffic between the inland Akan tribes and the Europeans on the coast, Ga mastery of the Portuguese-derived pidgin trade language that was used to interact with Europeans made them indispensable middlemen and interpreters for all Akwamo, Achim, and Ashanti traders. Things were to change dramatically from the 1640s, when the Ga progressively instituted a monopoly on trade with Europeans on the coast, insisting that all commercial exchanges be concentrated at the Abonse market at Ayawaso, and restricting coastal access to traders from the hinterland Akan. This state of affairs was to trigger major conflict, culminating in wars with the powerful military kingdom of Akwamo from 1677, who comprehensively defeated the Gas in 1681. The kingdom at Ayawaso was utterly decimated and their king, Okaikwe, decapitated. Akwamo was to exercise sovereignty over the Ga until 1730, when they were in their turn defeated by a joint army comprising Ga, Achim, and Akwapim soldiers, with the active support of the Europeans on the coast. One of the main effects of the destruction of the Ayawaso kingdom in 1681 and the enforced migration of the people at Ayawaso to the coast was the favoring and inter-ethnic hybridity that came to define Ga identity, especially in the formation of the Akuche, singular Akucho, under the shadows of the different European forts and castles on the coast. The term Akucho is translated into English by the word neighborhood, but it really means quarter. The Akucho was the primary unit of social organization of the Ga and comprised various families, sometimes based on shared trades and livelihoods. As we noted a moment ago, it was the mid-17th century wars with hinterland groups that saw the Gas fissuring and being reconstituted on the coast under the aegis of different European spheres of influence. After the destruction of the Kingdom of Ayawaso, what we would recognize today as a full-blown refugee crisis was in force. The Dutch had built Fort Crivecoeur in 1649. It was later renamed Asher Fort in Ashertown, also known as Kinka, a cannon's shot away from Fort James, which was itself put up by the English in 1672 in what was later to become Jamestown, but it's also known by its alternative local name of English. English is the local corruption of the word English. The Danes, on the other hand, established themselves much further eastward at Christiansborg Castle, itself first taken over from the Swedes and completed in 1661 at Osu. The conjuncture of the dates of the establishment of the European merchant presence on the coast with the escalation of conflicts between the Ga and their neighbors in the mid-17th century is not entirely accidental, as it has been shown that the European presence heightened the need for military protection of hinterland trade routes by both Ga and Akan to guarantee their continuing access to European merchandise on the coast. And by the end of the 17th century, the slave trade that had started from the 1510s had instituted a comprehensive transformation of all local states, converting war into a concomitant and necessary aspect of the slave trade itself. The Europeans were also obligingly to supply guns and ammunition to the Ga in exchange for favors of land, privileged access to hinterland markets, and for expansion of the slave trade. The Anglo-Danish Treaty of 1850 and the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1874 ensured that the entire Gold Coast was finally taken over by the British, with all their forts and castles on the coastline finally passing over to them. More importantly, the unification of the British administration under the new capital of Accra in 1877, coupled with a progressive pacification and incorporation of the other territories up north, set up a dynamic relationship between the city of Accra and its various labor and economic hinterlands, thus also ultimately altering the evolution of the Ga town for good. While Ga allegiance was for a long time to remain splintered along the European spheres of influence, even after the forts and castles were all incorporated into the singular British scheme from the mid-19th century, it is the Ga system of divisional Akuche, or quarters, as I mentioned earlier, that was to feed into political conflicts with the British colonial administration, and from the early 20th century into the character of Accra's spatial expansion. Each of the 6 Ga townships is divided into different Akuche, with the oldest Ga Mashie township, where both the Dutch Asher Fort and the English James Fort were built, being constituted by 7 Akuche, namely Abola, Bise, Ansre, and Otubluhum. These 4 are located in Kinka, or Dutch Accra, with Akangaji, Sempe, and Alata to be found at Jamestown or English Accra. If the formation of the Ga Mashie Akuche in the 17th century was influenced primarily by factors of kinship, localization, and the occupational specializations of fishing, fish processing, salt making, and trade, by the end of the 19th century, the Akuche were more significant as self-interested collective political agents in their interactions with the colonial administration, as well as within the context of inter-Akucho rivalries. The sociocultural mixtures central to Ga Akuche formation in the 17th century have been noted by various scholars, but never especially with respect to the significance of these fissures and hybridities for the town's spatial expansion beyond the Ga Mashie area. Hybrid Akuche formation was evident in several Akuche, but of special interest to us here is that of the Alata Akuche. When the British came to build their fort on the Accra coast in the 1670s, they brought with them slaves from Alada, also known as the Slave Coast in modern-day Benin. Fishermen from Moray, a town close to Cape Coast, augmented this slave labor pool. The Alada slaves and the Moray fishermen subsequently settled close to the James Fort and constituted themselves into the Alata quarter of Jamestown. Thus, they were an Akucho originally of strangers, and of course much more recent than the Akamaji, Bese, Ansre, and Simpe Akuche that dated from the Ayawaso kingdom. Today, the terms Alata, which is derived from the word Alada, and Anago, derived from the Yoruba group originally located on the present-day Benin-Nigeria border, are used by Ghanaians to designate anyone from Nigeria, whether of Yoruba provenance or otherwise. While it might be too far a stretch to suggest that the Yoruba presence on the Accra coast in the 17th century could be aligned to the vibrant commercial networks that they were to establish in the Gold Coast in later periods, it is still important to note that Yorubas had a major impact on Accra's urban formation well into the 20th century. Both Makola Market and Tudo stand as testaments to Yoruba trading influence on the city of Accra. Today, the English Alata Manche, or Chief's Palace, stands right across from James Fort and shows how closely connected to the English the Alata Akucho was, as they provided a stream of local labor for the Englishmen at the fort. The disease epidemics of 1908, bubonic plague, and 1911, yellow fever, and 1918, influenza, were to introduce new factors into the dynamics of town planning, with each epidemic leading to frantic efforts to decongest the core Ga Mashie area. The 1908 bubonic plague was especially significant in this regard, and was to affect mainly the English Jamestown area, with several recorded deaths between the first reported cases in August of 1907 and May of 1908. Desperate measures were required to contain the situation, and the Colonial Office dispatched one Sir W.J.R. Simpson to the colony. Simpson had already established his credentials fighting a bubonic plague epidemic in Calcutta in 1896, with his treatise on plague from 1905 quickly becoming a comprehensive classic on the question. His invitation to manage the colonial administration's response to the epidemic set the precedent for the transfer of best practices relating to disease and disaster management protocols from other areas of empire to the local context, with systematic cross-referencing to analogous colonial situations becoming most explicit in the colonial correspondence on Accra following the earthquake of 1939. While colonial officials had a number of meetings with the Ga chiefs to agree on crisis management measures. Their preferred method was the segregation and quarantine of infected or suspected individuals, and more controversially from the perspective of the residents in affected areas, the complete destruction of houses marked as harboring the offending mice during the bubonic plague. A cordon was also thrown around the town, with everyone required to carry a stamped document showing clearance to travel outside its boundary. This enforced quarantine first applied following the bubonic plague and then during the yellow fever epidemic of 3 years later, and led directly to the founding of Korle neighborhood in 1908, about a mile across the narrow isthmus west of Jamestown, and Adabraka, some 4 miles to the northeast of the coastal area. Korle was originally an isolation camp of temporary wooden houses for the relatives and associates of those that had died in the Alata quarter of Jamestown during the bubonic plague. It remained a largely makeshift settlement until the highly impressive Kojo Ababio, the Alatamanche, who had strenuously organized his people in the early stages of the crisis, put forward a formal request to the colonial administration to convert the temporary campsite into a more permanent settlement. With the building of the Korle Teaching Hospital in 1923, Korle was further transformed into a labor resource neighborhood to service the new medical establishment, with low-cost houses for workers laid out not far from the hospital itself. The mainly European doctors and medical administration officers at the time were conversely assigned houses in the newly developed Europeans-only neighborhood of Ridge. The Ga elites were persuaded by the prospects of the new township by the colonial government's introduction of a hire purchase scheme by which the Ga could borrow money from the government to build their houses and pay these back over a period of time, depending on the size of the loan and the rate of repayment. The grants of financial facilities from the colonial treasury for establishing the two emerging neighborhoods did not escape the vagaries of inter-Akutu rivalries, for the land at Korle was owned by the Alata Stu and the one at Adabraka by the Sempe Stu. We should pause for a moment to visualize the energetic scenes of hustle and bustle that marked the Jamestown harbor and its immediate vicinity by the first quarter of the 20th century. From the earliest period of European contact and well into the introduction of steamships in the 1820s, all ships had to lay anchor some 3 to 4 miles off the coastline. Canoes were then used to bring the goods in from the outlying ships to the landing shore, and they also transferred whatever shipments there were from the coast back onto the ships. Imports on the early part of the 20th century included all manner of manufactured goods, with the canoes carrying everything from textiles, whiskey, bicycles, and motorcycles to entire pianos and other such bulky goods. Motor vehicles were brought in pieces and reassembled by John Holt Bartholomew and Company on Station Road. Come the 1950s, and the scene laid out on the beach will have been an extraordinarily lively one, with European merchant representatives, insurers, small-scale buyers, and customs officers performing their several assigned roles amidst the teeming African boat crews and their variant cargoes. The commercial activities around the harbor were to ensure that the Jamestown area retained all the characteristics of a lively commercial hub until 1962, when all transshipment activities were transferred to the newly opened and much larger Deep Harbor Tema Harbor. 18 miles to the east of Accra. From a strictly spatial standpoint, Ga Mashie was very much a warehouse city, with a landscape dominated by large commercial warehouses owned by the likes of the British elder Dempster Lines and G.B. Oliphant, the Anglo-Greek artisan Zokonis or PZ, the Greek Cypriot A.G. Leventis, the French Compagnie Française de l'Afrique Occidentale CFAO, the Swedish United Trading Company UTC, not to speak of African merchants such as E.A. Manyo Plange, T.P. Alote, S.O. Akinwumi, and A.J. Okansi, all of whom had businesses in the Central Business District at various distances from the harbor. But it was not only the big establishments that had warehouses. Many homes in the area were designed for the storage of goods or for shops on their first floor, with the residential quarters on the second floor. Signs of the many warehouse homes can still be found in the area to this day. Today, James Fort is abandoned and decrepit, while Usher Fort is partly used as a tourist attraction. The harbor itself lies silent, with only a smattering of local fishing boats to remind us of its bustling heyday. But the rise and fall of Jamestown from the refugee crises of the 17th century to the lively commercial activities of the late 19th century up to the mid-20th century, and then to its demise as a hub of commercial activities that anchored the Central Business District, also serves to represent the expansion of Accra itself and how, in evolving into the lively metropolis that it is today, it has unfortunately left behind its older districts to fend for themselves, to remember their own history, and also to anticipate with some trepidation what is to come. Thank you very much. Please remember to check out the suggested readings in the episode's description. And if you like this episode, give a thumbs up, subscribe and share, hit the notifications bell so that you do not miss out on any upcoming episodes, and enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.